We're on part N of Paul, and the title is Paul Goes to Rome. And so we're working through this question sheet, and the material in front of us is Acts 27 and 28. And I'm going to get us started by reading a few verses out of Acts 27. And if you've looked at it today or in the last few days, you'll be reminded that this is the portion of Acts that deals with the voyage from the coast of Israel to Italy. Paul's being transported there for trial in front of Caesar. And there's a lot of nautical information, a lot of information about ships and wind and waves, and it culminates in the shipwreck on Malta. So we'll talk about that tonight. So here are in Acts 27, and let me read for you the first 8 verses. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius, and embarking in an Andromitian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. So you can tell already there's going to be a lot of place names, a lot of information about wind and sailing, and these chapters are extremely detailed. They have a lot of information about the kind of ship, about the winds, about sailing, about all kinds of information, interesting information here. So that occupies a good part of this. But there are always spiritual applications that we can learn about from these narratives. So the question sheet says these 2 chapters contain the narrative of a voyage to Rome, including a shipwreck and Paul's waiting period to meet with Caesar, who's the emperor of Rome, to plead his case. Question number 1, what rank did Julius, Paul's guard, have? Centurion. So a pretty high-ranking officer. I'm not sure what the equivalent would be in the U.S. Army, maybe a lieutenant or something like that. Roughly, a centurion is in charge of 100 soldiers. So he could have more under his command, but a relatively high-ranking officer is going to be Paul's guard for this trip. Who were at least 2 of Paul's companions on this voyage? Aristarchus and Luke, the guy who's writing the account. So these 2 guys, and probably a good deal of the information, the detail in this passage comes from Paul and from Luke. Why? Well, because they're travelers. Just like if you have traveled by air, if you're a frequent flyer, you can tell people, avoid that airport. That airport is nasty. This Southwest Airlines has a good hub in Pittsburgh. Use that one, And so you would have all that information, and that's probably where a good deal of the information in these chapters comes from, is the combined experience of Paul and Luke. Number 2, where did they put it into port in 27:3? Sidon. So this is on the coast. Here's a very, very rough map, and that's not accurate. They actually started about here. Sidon is today in Lebanon. So Tyre and Sidon, just a little bit south of Beirut today, and it's a major seaport town. A lot of trans-Mediterranean traffic went through there. And it's interesting, it says he received care from his friends. What kind of friends would they be? They're Christians. They're people that knew Paul, and he had a reputation. He was well known. Maybe he'd led some of them to the Lord. Maybe they'd sat under his ministry. And so he goes to meet with his friends. And what do you think it means that he would receive care? personal care, maybe just rest. Maybe, you know, they gave him some good food to eat. Maybe they had a nice bed he could sleep on for a couple nights. Possibly medical care. Possibly. Now, we know that he had a thorn in the flesh. He had some physical malady. He had some issue. We don't know what it was. There's a lot of theories. They range from malaria to eye problems to head injuries to, you know, we just don't know. Anything we do is speculation. But it does seem like from time to time he needed medical attention. And that may be another reason why Luke is a great friend to him, because Luke is a physician. He's a doctor. And so possibly, we can't be firm on it, but possibly in addition to rest, he received medical care. Number 3, what does verse 4 mean? Verse 4 says, "From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary." So what does that mean? All right, headwinds, at least headwinds. So the ancient world, you got to think in terms of sail. No motors, so you're dependent on the wind. Now, it is possible if the wind is blowing off of your quarter. So if you're trying to sail due west, say, and you have a wind coming off the northwest, it is possible to make progress, but it's very laborious. It's called tacking. You tack, and you catch the wind with your sail by turning the sail in a certain way, and you lean the ship over, and so on. It'd be something like, remember when you were a kid and you were riding a bicycle and you came to a really steep hill? How did you go up the hill? Pump and pump, and what else? You go this way, and this way, and this way, because you can't, there's no way that you can get the momentum and the speed to go straight up. So tacking is, the wind comes off a quarter, and you catch it with your sail, and so you sail this way, and then you turn, and you sail this way, and you're making slow progress in the direction you want to go, but it's not ideal. So there's a headwind, the winds are contrary. And then it says in verse 6 of chapter 27, there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. So what sort of a ship did the centurion find? I just said it. Alexandrian ship. Now this could be significant. Again, we don't know for sure because the text doesn't say 100%. But my map didn't turn out to scale very well. So here's Alexandria, Egypt. Here's Jerusalem. This is the coast of Israel. Cyprus is over in here. Here's Crete. And this is supposed to be the boot of Israel, of Italy rather. It's not great. So it's not the scale. From here to Malta, Malta's way over here, is something like 600 miles, maybe 800 miles. So this is not the scale. What was happening in the 1st century AD and before then and up through 300, 350 AD was the city of Rome was huge. It was humongous. And the population had actually outstripped the ability of the Italian countryside to grow enough wheat and barley and rye so that the millers could turn the grain into flour to bake bread. And so the authorities came up with a plan, and the breadbasket of the world, even to this date, is not Italy, but anybody know? Not the U.S., no. Not Kansas, not Iowa, no, not that. It's the Nile River. Because it floods every year, and the ground is extremely fertile, and it supplies grain for a huge chunk of the Middle East. So a very large city at the Nile Delta, Alexandria. In fact, in our Bible studies, we run across a guy out of Alexandria whom Aquila and Priscilla taught. Apollos of Alexandria. That's the city. Here it is, and the city of Rome had regular ships running a regular route from Alexandria to Italy on a regular basis. Now, here's a place where the detail of Acts 27-28 get very interesting, as well as understanding from archaeology and history and researching ancient writings. Did you notice in, I'm looking for the number of passengers on board the ship. Where is it? Do you remember? So that number is accurate, 276, including crew and passengers. But this is not actually a passenger vessel. This is a cargo vessel. Well, okay, so what was its cargo? Well, it doesn't say in the text, but it was probably, likely, grain. It was probably an Alexandrian grain ship. What were these things? Now, modern science, modern historians, modern archaeologists, whatever, look at the ancient world and they say, well, ancient man was limited, not real intelligent. They didn't have a lot of technology. They didn't have the ability to build big things, even though, you know, you have things like the pyramids and so on. But they would look at this and say, well, you know, those grain ships, they were probably maybe the size of the Mayflower, you know, maybe 40, 50 feet long, maybe a beam. So when you measure a ship, here's a couple of things you use. The keel is the length of the main beam at the bottom of the ship. So that's roughly how long it is. The beam is how wide it is side to side at its widest point. So Alexandrian grain ships, we know from writings and from other sources, they have carvings, they have pictures of them. They had a single mast a little bit forward of the center point, and then they had a bowsprit with a sail on the front of it. A large square sail, both these are square sails. And they didn't have a steering wheel, and they didn't have a rudder. Instead, they had steering oars. So they had a long oar, and they normally had two of them, one on either side at the stern of the ship. It might come up and have a crosspiece, and in heavy seas, you would need more than one sailor on it because it's rugged. You're trying to get the ship to turn, and you're pushing with all of your weight and strength to turn that boat by means of these steering oars. So rudders were not a thing yet in the Mediterranean. So these are steering oars. But the whole ship could have had a displacement of 2,000 tons. That is a big ship, possibly 180, 200 feet long and a beam of 45 feet. These are massive vessels. These are very large vessels. And the scripture record is very clear. They had 276 people on board, and it wasn't even designed, it's not for passengers, it's a cargo vessel. And it says they were throwing the cargo overboard. Well, this is a big boat. This is very, very large. And you needed that because you're taking tons and tons of grain from Egypt, about 800 miles or so across the Mediterranean to the north and to the west to Italy. And you've got to make that run many times a year. So that is what's going on here. Quite back to question 3. This ship was likely one of a class of vessels called Alexandrian grain ships, which made a regular run from Alexandria, Egypt, to ports near Rome to bring grain for bread to feed the huge population in and around Rome. These ships were gigantic by ancient standards and large even by modern standards. What sort of sailing conditions did they encounter in 27:7 and 8? Severe winds, slow sailing with difficulty. And where did they land? Fair havens near Lasea. And so this is on the island of Crete. The fast In question number 4, the fast in 27:9 refers to the Day of Atonement. Day of Atonement is, your sheet is incorrect. It's not Rosh Hashanah, it's Yom Kippur. And this occurs in late September or early October. So why is this date marker significant? Why does Luke include that? Because it's at the end of the sailing season. This is the time of year when sailors say, well, no, we're not going to try to cross the Med now. This is too risky. It'd be like, somebody driving from Boston to Fort Kent, Maine, on the Canadian border. And now you'd say, well, it's June. What a beautiful drive. It'll probably take you 7 hours, maybe 8 hours. Drive all the way up there. You'll love it. And somebody says to you in the middle of January, I'm going to drive from Boston to Fort Kent. And you say, you're going to do what? That's not a good idea. Well, why not? There's this stuff called snow. And you could run into high winds. You could run into a blizzard. Well, that's this here. So there's a sailing season when the winds are nice and they're running in the right direction. The waves are big, but it's what you do. And then you get beyond. You're at the edge of sailing season, and now it's getting more dangerous. And so this is in the time of year, late September, early October, where this is beginning to occur. So in chapter 27, verse 10 gives us a conversation of Paul with the centurion, the pilot, and the ship's captain. And it does not seem to be a revelation from God to him. So here's what it says in 27:9. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo on the ship, but also of our lives. Now, it doesn't seem like, at least it doesn't say, that God revealed to Paul, this is a very bad idea. Don't go on this trip. It doesn't seem like this is a direct revelation to Paul from God. So how does Paul know this? Experience. He's traveled a lot. He's been all over the Mediterranean many times. And just like we were just saying, a hypothetical traveler from North Carolina who's up here in June, and you say, drive through Maine. Maine is beautiful. Look at all the lighthouses. And then in January, they say, I'm going to drive through Maine. And you say, you might want to check your reservations and make sure you have hotels every few miles because the weather could get to you. Well, Paul knows. Paul has experience in this. That seems to be why he's saying this. Question number 5, what kind of a wind came up and where were they sailing in 27:13? So a south wind, a moderate south wind. And this is nice. And everybody says, oh, beautiful. We have a window yet. The weather's not closing in. This is a sign. It'd be like here in New England, you get to middle of October and it's been crisp, it's been cold, and then all of a sudden you wake up and one day it's 75 degrees, the sun is shining. Indian summer. We're in for a nice couple of weeks. And of course in New England, it might last 10 hours and then you're done. That's what happened. They get this moderate south wind, and the captain, the pilot, everybody says, oh, this is great. We're going to have a nice voyage. It's going to be good. So they start out, and then in 27:14, but before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Euraquilo. And here's a violent wind that comes rushing down. It would be the equivalent here in this part of the country to a nor'easter. So this is the ferocity, the wind, the weather, possibly rain, and you look out at waves, and yesterday the waves were 1 to 3 feet, and now they're 9 to 12 feet. And the wind is blowing the crest of the waves over, and it's getting not good. So, number 7, what technique did they use for strengthening the ship in 27:17? So, on a vessel, I'm just going to draw over the top of this. On a vessel of an extreme length, and this can actually happen even in gigantic cargo freighters today. It's called hogging, and what it is supposing the waves are huge. You get waves that are 30, 40, 50 feet from crest to trough. And what would happen if there was a crest of a wave here and a crest of a wave here? There's nothing supporting it in the middle. What could happen? Snap in half. The ship could break the keel. The main beam that runs the length of the ship could snap in half. And now you're done. You're cooked. It could happen the other way too. It's still called hogging, but imagine if there's a crest of a wave right in the center. And all the weight at either end of the ship is right there on that point. It's like a seesaw, a fulcrum. And if this thing is loaded with 2,000 tons of cargo and 276 people, snap. And there's stories, you know, of ships at sea, and you hear a big crack, and it was the keel. This is a beam that is 3 feet thick, 4 or 5 feet deep, but it's the backbone, it's the spine of the ship. If your keel breaks, you have a broken back. You are in very serious trouble. It's going to come apart. So what do? Well, they put cables underneath and wrap it around. Now I've tried to research this a little bit. How would you do that? I can think of one way. They would send a sailor with a line, and they'd say, "Okay, Harvey, you're the newbie. you drew the short straw. We'll get you extra beans if you survive." And they toss him overboard, and he's got to swim underneath with that cable and come up on the other side in a storm, being driven by this wind, and hands the cable up.
They didn't have stuff that could swim underwater.
No. No scuba gear, no snorkels, just hold your breath.
It's a long ways to go.
Yeah, you're not kidding. So maybe next year, Nathan and I have been talking about this. There's some verses in the Bible about ropes and cords and string and so on. And it might be that next year we'll do a cultural background study again and talk about how did they make rope in the ancient world. It would be natural fibers, obviously, no nylon, no polypropylene. Something like hemp or reeds that would retain some flexibility and pliability, wouldn't get brittle. But these, you know, to undergird a ship of this size, you're talking, these aren't little strings, these are cables. And you wrap it around. Now, I don't know if there's any other way that they could do it. Like, could you have a loop at the front, at the bow of the ship with a couple of guys holding it down in the water with a weight at the bottom, and then let the ship run over it and you pull it up and snug it? I'm not sure. I don't know how they did, but they evidently knew about this technique, and they are experiencing something with the ship, something like the hogging I was describing, that make them say, we are in serious trouble, and we have got to get this thing stabilized so it doesn't break in two. So they undergird the ship with supporting cables. Question number 8, what happened over the next several days in 27:18 to 20? Yeah, an incredible storm. So here's what it says in 18. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. What's the ship's tackle? All the gear and the rigging, all spare, you know, nothing that was, everything that was tied down or was in use had to stay, but spare pulleys and spare ropes and spare spars and anything that was extra rigging or gear, over it goes. They threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small storm was assailing us, from then on all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. Wow. They are being driven from east to west by this incredible storm that has lasted for days. And they have they've thrown over the cargo in verse 18, the ship's tackle in verse 19, and they haven't seen sun or stars in many days. It's just overcast and maybe raining, wind and water and waves for days and days. And gradually, they lose all hope. What words of encouragement did Paul speak to the passengers and crew in verses 21 to 26? God is going to get us through. He says there's not going to be any loss of life. We all have to stay with the ship. The ship will be lost. Now this seems more like a revelation from God. In fact, he even says in verse 23, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me. So this is a revelation. And God, through the angel, has told Paul, the ship is going to be destroyed. There's going to be a shipwreck. But nobody's going to die. And you, Paul, have a job to do. You're going to stand in front of Caesar. So God reassures Paul, and Paul tries to reassure the crew. What does it mean that the sailors took soundings in 27:28? Yeah. So you know the term knots, K-N-O-T-S. So this is a measure of speed on the water. And it's by holding a weighted rope, and the rope in our Western European traditions has a knot every 6 feet. 6 feet is a fathom. And they used something similar. They used a knot with a lead weight at the bottom to drag it down, and when it hits bottom, by measuring how many knots there are, you can tell, well, we have 20 feet below the keel. And what you do is you take soundings like every 10 or 15 minutes. And you can actually use the same technique with a lead weight and a little scoop or a can on the bottom. And you can pull that back up and look at what's in the can. And if you have sand, well, that's the bottom of the ocean. But what happens if you start finding like broken shell? You're getting close to land. And what happens if you find both broken shell, and 10 minutes ago the sounding was there's 45 feet, but now there's 37 feet. You're getting close. Well, that's what's going on here. So they're taking soundings. And you can see that Luke and Paul are familiar with this. They've been on boats. They're familiar with what this means. And so what did they fear, and what did they do in 27:29? They were afraid that they would go aground. And what often happens, and the coast of New England is notorious, all the way down to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, the whole eastern seaboard, but some spots in particular, coast of Maine, near Cape Cod, Massachusetts, those kinds of places are notorious as graveyards for ships. And what often happens is, in a storm, the ship is driven onto rocks, but you're not at the shore yet. You're just on rocks 100 yards from the shore. And now your prow, your bow is stuck. It's been driven up onto the rocks, but the storm is still going on. What happens? The storm, the waves break up the ship and destroy it completely. And of course, if you're a human being in that vessel, it's bad news. You know, you're very likely to drown, because you're 100 yards from the shore rocks and waves knocking you back and forth and so on. So that's what they're afraid of. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wish for daybreak. So these are either sea anchors or they're actual anchors. The ancient anchors used by the Roman vessels were very much like ours today. So they have this traditional shape with a couple of flukes, and they look like that. Sea anchors are quite often something like a big metal hoop with very strong canvas that's been stitched extra tight, extra strong around that, kind of like a big parachute. And then they throw it out the back, out the stern of the vessel. What are they trying to do? Sorry? Slow it down. And another very important piece of this, stabilize in this way, keep it pointed in the right direction. You want it pointed into the wind or following the wind. You don't want it to go broach. So the waves, imagine that this line right here is the land, the shore. And the waves are pushing this way. So here's the waves, here's your boat. That's okay. And these anchors would help to drag, they might grab the bottom if they're anchors. If they're sea anchors, they're grabbing water and slowing you down and keeping you pointed with the wind going the long ways along the long axis of the ship. But if something were to happen and your ship turned this way, the wind is going like this, what happens now? Capsize. You're blown over, and the lee side of the ship will get down, 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 and then the water starts pouring into any open hatch. If there's any loose seams, you start taking on water, and the heavier the boat gets, the more it settles, and now you're in serious trouble. So the anchors are an attempt to slow it down and keep it pointed with the wind going the right way, so that they don't go sideways and capsize. So thank you. Number 9. What were the crew trying to do in 2730? So the crew, we don't know how many crew members there are, but the crew, apparently they'd been whispering, saying, we're really close to the beach, we are in serious trouble. These landlubbers are going to be the death of us. We know how to get out of here. There's a ship's boat. Ship's boat is a small vessel that was often towed behind it. They did have, and they knew how to use a derrick to lift the boat up and have it on board. We're not sure. One other indication in these chapters says they had trouble getting the ship's boat under control. And that might make it sound like the small boat, the ship's boat, was behind it on a long tether. But the crew is under the guise of, oh, we're making repairs, we're going to be okay. But Paul notices that they're all climbing down the ladder to get into the ship's boat. And so he tells the centurion what? If the crew doesn't stay with us, we're all going to die. Now, again, not clear whether this is God's revelation or his own experience. But God apparently had said, everybody is safe, but just stay together. So, how did he encourage everyone in 27:33 through 37? He said, we haven't eaten in it. You guys haven't eaten in 14 days. And we're just barely getting by here. And he's very cheerful. What a guy. You know, they've been driven by the wind, this incredible storm. Everybody's given up hope. They've all gradually given up hope. They say, we're all dead. There's no way that we get out of this alive. But Paul says, you guys, you got to eat something. You need some strength. God is going to take care of all of us. We're going to be okay. The ship is going to break up, but we're all going to make it to land. We're all going to be okay. You need to eat something. And then I find it very interesting. In verse 35, having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. So, Paul gave thanks to God right here. And I am reminded of many times in the Lord's ministry. In fact, the Last Supper, he broke the bread and thanked God and gave it away. And he was thanking God for the representation of that bread and that cup. And what it represented was him. He was going to be dying in a couple of hours, but he gave thanks. Carl?
So the terminology there, the breaking of the bread, was that indicated as ceremonial or?
It's a loaf of bread, and
Did you say waiting toward the part?
yes, yeah, just he's breaking up the bread and he's giving out part of it, and so on. You know, given the circumstances here, it's unlikely that this was fresh baked bread. These big ships did have ways of baking bread on board, but 14 days of storm, this is probably more like hardtack, biscuit, or matzos or something like that. It's probably hard bread, but it's nutritious. Have some to eat. And in the presence of everybody, without any hesitation, he gives thanks to God. What is he thanking God for? The food. What else? Taking care of him so far. And with confidence that God is going to take care of them. He's trusting that God is going to do what he told Paul he was going to. Everybody's going to survive. Everybody's going to be okay. And so he gives thanks. And then, did everyone make it safely from the wreck to the shore? Yes, they did. What a sight that must have been. I've seen paintings of shipwrecks on the New England shore, and people coming up out of the waves and the breakers, and you know their clothes are sopping wet, and they're just staggering. But can you imagine being on the shore of Malta in this storm, the driving wind and the rain, and here comes somebody, and they're all clinging to bits of barrels and crates and planks of wood, and here comes somebody else, and 276 come dripping out of the water, and they made it. They made it safely to the shore. Number 10, what remarkable thing happened in 28, 3 through 6?
Paul was bitten by the poisonous snake and wasn't hungry.
So a viper, you know, they're picking up sticks to start a fire because everybody's freezing, and they're going to start a fire. And so Paul is pitching in, he's picking up sticks to throw on the fire, and he grabs a bundle of sticks, and there's a snake in it, a venomous snake, and it latches right onto him. And, you know, it's there, and he just shakes it off into the fire. And the natives, this is the island of Malta, and the natives are also, oh, he must be a terrible, terrible person. He's a criminal, and he's escaped from justice, but the fate has found him, and the snake bit him, and he's gonna puff up. Watch now, he's gonna swell up and turn green, and then he'll tip over. And you know they're all waiting for this to happen, and then it didn't happen. And so, what did they say after that? If he's not a criminal, then he must be a god. So, they were. What did God do through Paul for Publius' father? Healed him of a recurrent fever and dysentery. And how long, number 11, how long were they on Malta? 3 months. So 3 months. And Paul makes note that they showed extraordinary kindness. So the Maltese people took care of them, sheltered them, gave them clothes, and fed them, and so on. In 28, 13, and 14, where did they land in Italy, and who did they find there? Puteoli is the name of the port town, and they found some brethren. What does that mean? Christians. There's Christians there. Number 12, who did Paul call to meet with him when he arrived in Rome? Leading men of the Jews. So it's possible that he's thinking, I'm going to be on trial in front of Caesar, and I would kind of like to nip in the bud any possible charges or complaints against me that's coming from the Jews. So he meets with them, identifies who he is, and he says, so do you guys know who I am? Do you have you had any communication from, say, the temple in Jerusalem where all this trouble started? Has the high priest or anybody been in touch with you about me? And what do they say? No, nothing. We got nothing. We don't know anything about this. This is all new news to us. Number 13, there's a wrong reference there. In 28:23, not 13, 28 verse 23. How many Jews came to Paul's rented house? A large number. It doesn't give an exact number, but a large number of them. And how long did he discuss Jesus Christ with them? Morning till evening. So he started sometime in the morning and it went all day long. Notice once again that Paul is on trial and he is going to have a hearing in front of Caesar. But that's not even the main thing on his mind. Yes, he does meet with the Jews and he says, have you guys got any letters or anything about me? But what is his main concern always? Talk about Jesus Christ. Tell people about the Lord. So what material did he use? The scriptures, the law and the prophets. He uses the Old Testament. That's the only material that's available. That's what he uses. Did any of them believe?
Some did.
Yes, some did. Some did, some didn't. And what words of warning and rebuke did Paul give to them in 28, 26, and 27?
You will hear but not understand, and you will see but you won't perceive what you're saying.
Yep. And so he says, God has sent word of this salvation to the Gentiles. And some of the Jews departed, and they were having great dispute among themselves. So a few closing remarks on this. We do have one more lesson on the Apostle Paul to go before we finish out this section of our character study. But here, to the best of our knowledge, Paul was released from this imprisonment, known as his first Roman imprisonment. While in chains in Rome, we believe he wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. After his release, he went on to serve the Lord for some more years. It is possible that he did actually go to Spain as he wanted, Romans 15:28, and some have speculated that he traveled as far as the British Isles, though that is very speculative. After more ministry and doubtless many more adventures and lives influenced for Christ, Paul was again arrested and put in prison in the notorious Mamertine prison in Rome. It was there that he died, possibly from disease or perhaps by being beheaded. It was during that last imprisonment that he wrote his last known letter, 2 Timothy. That short book will be the final installment in our studies on the life of Paul next lesson. Comments or questions? The amount of detail in these chapters about nautical things and geography is really remarkable, really, really interesting. I find it a fascinating insight into ancient technology and skill. Okay, take your prayer bulletins